Remember me, Cowboy? I'm the Apache girl you saved years ago. I've returned to marry you. Somewhere between the canyon shadow and the open range, where silence grew thicker than sage, a man found redemption waiting at his door. Herb Foster walked out to check his fence line that afternoon and saw her standing there like prophecy made flesh. A woman dressed in red fringe and turquoise, feathers woven into hair black as coal, her dark eyes fixed on him with the intensity of someone who'd crossed impossible distances to arrive at this exact moment. She wore the ceremonial dress of her people, beadwork that told stories in every stitch. When she smiled, it was not hesitant or uncertain. It was the smile of someone who'd already made her choice. "Remember me, Cowboy?" she asked, her voice steady as stone. "I'm the Apache girl you saved years ago. I've returned to marry you." Herb stared at her, his mind scrambling back 8 years to a dying child at his well, to cracked lips and sunburned skin, to a small hand accepting water like it was salvation. She'd been maybe 10 years old then, trembling and half wild. Now she stood before him fully grown, fully certain, and he realized with the slow horror of a man watching a storm approach that she meant every word she'd just said. Herb Foster had built his life on this land for one reason: to disappear. Not from the law, he'd never been wanted for anything official, but from memory itself. From the screams that still woke him some nights. From the faces of men he'd killed during the territorial wars, when the line between soldier and murderer blurred into something he could never quite wash off. The ranch sat at the edge of nowhere, pressed against canyon walls on one side and endless scrubland on the other. The nearest town was a half-day's ride, and that was exactly how he wanted it. No neighbors asking questions. No witnesses to the man he'd been. Just cattle, silence, and the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. He'd chosen isolation on purpose, but not loneliness. Loneliness found him anyway. That afternoon, after the Apache woman appeared at his gate, Herb went about his work the same as always. He fed the horses, checked the cattle in the south pasture, repaired the section of fence where the wood had weathered gray and brittle. But his mind kept circling back to her words, to the absolute conviction in her voice. "I've returned to marry you," as if it were already decided. As if the 8 years between that day and this one had been nothing but preparation for an inevitable conclusion. He told himself it was madness. The girl, Erica, she'd said her name was Erica Hodges, had been delirious with heat and thirst when he'd found her collapsed near his well. She'd probably confused him with someone else, built him up in her memory into something he wasn't. A hero. A savior. Someone worthy of the kind of devotion she was offering. He was none of those things. He was just a man trying to atone for sins by working himself half to death in a place where nobody cared enough to remember them. But that night, lying on the narrow cot in his cabin, Herb couldn't shake the image of her standing there in full ceremonial dress, eyes holding his without flinching, speaking of sacred vows and debts of honor. The air felt different now, charged with something he couldn't name. The horses were restless in the corral. He could hear them shifting, hooves scraping against packed earth. Once, the roan mare let out a sharp whinny that cut through the darkness like a warning. Herb sat up, listening. Nothing followed. Just wind pushing through the canyon and the distant howl of something hunting in the hills. He lay back down, staring at the rough beams of the ceiling, telling himself tomorrow everything would return to normal. She'd realize her mistake. She'd leave. He'd be alone again, the way he deserved to be. He was still telling himself that when the sun rose. Herb stepped outside at first light, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders and squinting against the glare. The sky stretched pale and endless above him, and the valley spread out in its familiar pattern of scrub grass and stone. And then he saw them. At first he thought he was imagining it, his eyes adjusting wrong to the morning light, but the shapes on the ridge didn't disappear when he blinked. They solidified. Riders. Dozens of them. Apache warriors on horseback, lined across the northern ridge like sentries, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky. He turned his head and saw more on the eastern hills. More still along the western slope where the dry creek bed cut through the land. Everywhere he looked, there were more. They sat in perfect stillness, watching. Waiting. Some carried rifles. Others held spears, the metal tips catching the early sun like signals. Herb's chest tightened. This wasn't a raiding party. This was something else entirely. Something deliberate and ceremonial and utterly beyond his understanding. And then he saw her. Erica Hodges stood at the center of his yard, still dressed in red and turquoise, her back straight as a lodgepole pine. She was looking at him with an expression that managed to be both patient and immovable, the way mountains are patient, the way stone is immovable. They came to witness, she said simply, as if that explained everything. When an Apache woman claims a life debt, her people honor it. They will wait until you accept or refuse. But they will wait, Herb Foster. And so will I. Herb's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he'd left leaning against the doorframe, but he stopped himself. This wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. And somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the panic and confusion, a terrible truth was dawning. His life of isolation, of penance, of carefully maintained distance from everything and everyone. That life was over. Thanking you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin. Herb stood frozen in his doorway, the morning sun climbing behind the ridge of Apache warriors, casting their shadows long across his land. His mind was still catching up to what his eyes were seeing, the woman in ceremonial dress, the silent witnesses on horseback, the absolute impossibility of what was happening. You can't be serious, he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Erica tilted her head slightly, studying him the way she had 8 years ago when she drank from his ladle. Among my people, a life debt is the most sacred of bonds. You gave me water when I was dying. You wrapped me in your blanket. You pointed me toward the hills when you could have turned me away or worse. That kindness cannot go unanswered. It was just water. Herb stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting packed earth. Any decent person would have done the same. But they didn't. Her words were simple, final. You did. I made a vow that day, Cowboy. I swore to the spirits and to myself that if I survived, I would return and bind my life to yours. I am here to fulfill that vow. Herb looked past her to the warriors on the ridges, then back to her face. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, not the soft beauty of parlor girls in town, but something carved from the same stone as these canyons. Fierce and enduring. Your people are watching. They're expecting you to, what? Marry some broken-down rancher twice your age because he gave you a drink? They're expecting me to honor my word. Erica stepped closer, close enough that he could see the turquoise beads woven into her hair, the careful stitching on her dress. I am not a child anymore, Herb Foster. I chose this path knowing exactly what it meant. I spent 8 years preparing for this moment. Learning your language. Understanding your ways. Becoming worthy of the vow I made. You don't owe me anything. Herb's throat tightened. Go back to your people. Find someone your own age, someone who. I will not leave. Her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It simply became immovable. If you refuse me, I will remain on your land until you accept or until I die here. Those are the only 2 paths available now. My people will wait. They will watch. And they will bear witness to your choice, whatever it may be. Herb stared at her, searching for any hint of uncertainty, any crack in her resolve. He found none. The girl he'd saved had been desperate, frightened, clinging to life by threads. This woman was something else entirely. She had walked back into his world carrying the weight of 8 years and a sacred promise, and she would not be moved by his protests or his guilt. She was a storm that had finally arrived, and he had no shelter left to hide in. She made camp beneath the cottonwood near the creek bed, the only tree on his property with enough shade to matter. Herb watched from his porch as she unpacked a bedroll, a cooking pot, supplies wrapped in oiled canvas. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She built a small fire ring with stones, gathered kindling from the scrub brush, and by nightfall had a lean-to constructed from branches and hide that looked more permanent than he cared to admit. The warriors on the ridges remained motionless, patient as the stones themselves. Herb tried to ignore her. He rode out to check the north pasture at dawn, spent the morning moving cattle to better grass, returned at noon dusty and tired. When he came back, 3 sections of his fence line had been repaired. The posts he'd been meaning to replace for months now stood straight, wrapped with fresh wire. Erica was nowhere in sight, but her fire burned low and steady beneath the cottonwood. The next day she mended the gate that had been hanging crooked since last winter. The day after that, he found his water trough scrubbed clean, the algae that had been building up along the edges completely gone. She never asked permission. Never announced what she was doing. She simply moved through his land like water finding its level, filling in the gaps he'd left neglected. He told himself it irritated him. A stranger touching his things, working his property without being asked. But when he checked her repairs, he found them solid. Better than solid. The fence wire was wrapped tight as anything he could have done, the gate hung level and swung smooth. She knew what she was doing. By the 4th day, he stopped pretending not to notice her. She was in the corral with the roan mare, the one that usually shied from everyone, even him. But Erica stood beside the horse with one hand resting on its neck, speaking in Apache too quiet for him to hear. The mare's ears were forward, relaxed. When Erica moved, the horse followed. She trusts you, Herb said from the fence rail. Erica glanced at him, the first time she'd acknowledged his presence in days. Animals know intention. They sense when someone means harm and when someone means peace. She ran her hand along the mare's flank. Your horses are well cared for. They know you have a good heart, even if you've forgotten." The words landed heavier than she probably intended. Herb looked away, jaw tight. "I've got work to do." "As do I." That evening he found stew waiting in a pot by his door, still warm. Rabbit and wild onions, seasoned with something he didn't recognize but tasted like smoke and sage. He ate it standing on his porch, watching her fire glow beneath the cottonwood. She sat cross-legged beside the flames, working on something with her hands, beadwork, maybe, or leather. Her silhouette was steady, unmoving except for the small motions of her craft. The warriors on the ridges had multiplied. He counted 30 now, maybe more in the shadows. Herb finished the stew and realized with uncomfortable clarity that his cabin felt emptier than it had in years. Not lonely, he'd made peace with loneliness long ago. This was different. This was the hollow ache of something missing that he hadn't known he needed until someone showed him it could exist. He set the empty pot down and went inside, closing the door against the feeling. But it followed him anyway. The ride into town took 3 hours, and Herb felt the stairs before he even dismounted. He'd come for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, the usual necessities that kept a man going another month. But the moment he tied his horse to the rail outside Garrett's general store, he knew something had shifted. Men stood in clusters along the boardwalk, their conversation stopping as he passed. A woman pulled her child closer, her eyes narrowing. Old Sam Garrett, who'd sold him goods for 5 years without comment, looked up from his counter with an expression caught between concern and accusation. "Heard you got company out at your place," Sam said, weighing out coffee beans with slow deliberation. Herb kept his voice level. "News travels fast. Apache woman in full ceremonial dress, camping on your land. Warriors watching from the hills." Sam tied off the burlap sack harder than necessary. "That the kind of company you're keeping now, Foster?" "She's not causing trouble." "Not yet." Sam slid the supplies across the counter. "But folks are nervous. We've had peace for 2 years now. People don't want reasons to break it." Herb paid and gathered his goods, but he didn't make it to his horse before Dalton Creel stepped into his path. The man was broad-shouldered and granite-faced, his gray beard trimmed sharp, his eyes holding the kind of hatred that had calcified over years into something permanent. Herb had known this conversation was coming. He'd been avoiding Creel since he'd settled here, hoping distance and silence would be enough. It wasn't. "Heard you're harboring savages now, Foster." Creel's voice carried across the street, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That true? She's on my land. Not bothering anyone. Your land borders 3 ranches, including mine. You think I want Apache warriors watching my property? Counting my cattle?" Creel stepped closer, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You think I've forgotten what they did during the wars? What you did?" Herb felt his chest tighten. "That's old history, Creel." "History?" Creel's laugh was bitter. "My son was 23 years old when you put a bullet in him. You called it self-defense. I called it murder. And now you're taking up with their kind." He spat into the dirt. "You got a death wish, that's your business. But when those warriors come down from those hills looking for blood, they won't stop at your fence line." The men on the boardwalk had gone silent, watching. Herb could feel the weight of their judgment, the old fears rising like smoke. He'd come here to escape his past, but the past had followed him anyway. It always did. "She's not leaving," Herb said quietly. "And neither am I." Creel's face darkened. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought. You keep that woman on your land, Foster, and you're inviting war. And this time, I won't wait for the law to handle it." He turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. The crowd dispersed slowly, but their eyes lingered. Herb loaded his supplies and rode out of town with the distinct feeling that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The past wasn't just close. It was circling. They came with the sunrise, emerging from the canyon like shadows gaining substance. Herb was checking the horses when he heard them, the soft thunder of hooves on hard earth, measured and deliberate. He turned to see a dozen Apache warriors riding in formation toward his ranch, and at their center rode a man who could only be Erica's brother. Dakota was tall and lean, his face sharp as flint, his bare chest marked with scars that told stories Herb couldn't read. He wore his hair long, decorated with feathers and bone, and carried a rifle across his lap with the casual confidence of someone who'd used it many times. The warriors fanned out behind him in a half-circle, cutting off any path of retreat. Erica stepped out from beneath the cottonwood, her expression unreadable. She said something in Apache, her voice calm but firm. Dakota answered without looking at her, his eyes locked on Herb. "You are Herb Foster." It wasn't a question. His English was precise, each word chosen carefully. "The man my sister claims saved her life. I gave her water," Herb said. "Nothing more. Nothing more." Dakota dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to the warrior beside him. He walked forward until he stood 10 feet from Herb, close enough to see the gray in Herb's beard, the lines around his eyes. "My sister has bound herself to you with sacred words. She has waited 8 years to fulfill this vow. And I come to ask, what manner of man accepts such an honor? I didn't accept anything. I told her to go home. Yet she remains." Dakota's gaze was unwavering. "Because you have not refused her properly. You have not sent her away with conviction. You let her live on your land, eat your food, mend your fences. You accept her work but not her heart. This is the behavior of a coward." Herb felt heat rise in his chest. "I'm trying to do right by her. She deserves better than." "Than what?" "Than a man who lives alone in the desert, hiding from his own people." Dakota took another step forward. "I know what you did in the wars, Foster. I know you killed men. Apache men. Your own kind too. I know you carry their deaths like stones in your chest." He paused, letting the words settle. "A warrior understands killing. But a warrior also understands honor. So I ask you now, are you worthy of my sister's devotion?" Erica moved between them, her voice sharp. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Herb, then toward her brother. Dakota listened but didn't back down. "She defends you," he said, switching back to English. "She says you are gentle. That you have a good heart beneath the guilt. That you saved her when others would have let her die." He drew a knife from his belt, the blade catching the morning light. "Words are easy, Foster. Show me your worth. Prove to me you deserve what my sister offers." Through word or blade, the choice is yours. The warriors watched in silence. Erica's eyes pleaded with Herb, but she didn't speak. Herb looked at the knife, then at Dakota's face, and realized this moment had been inevitable from the start. Herb had chosen words over the blade, and Dakota had accepted it with a single nod before riding back into the hills. But the warriors remained on the ridges, watching, waiting for something neither Herb nor Erica could name. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the canyon walls, Herb found himself walking toward the cottonwood where Erica's fire burned low. She looked up as he approached, her face shadowed in the fading light. "You may sit if you wish." He lowered himself onto a flat stone across from her, the fire crackling between them. For a long moment neither spoke. The desert stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, holding its secrets the way it always had. "Tell me about that day," Herb said finally. "The day I found you." Erica's hands stilled on the beadwork in her lap. "I was 10 years old. My family had been traveling to meet another band near the Salt Flats. There was an argument. My uncle and my father disagreed about the route. In the night, I wandered from camp. By the time I realized I was lost, the sun had already risen." She stared into the flames. "I walked for 2 days. No water. No shade. I began to see things that weren't there, my mother calling to me, pools of water that vanished when I reached them. I knew I was dying. And then you found my well. And then I found you." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask questions or demand payment. You simply gave. And when I tried to thank you, you waved me away like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, Herb Foster. It was everything." Herb shifted on the stone, uncomfortable with the weight she was placing on that moment. Any decent person would have been afraid, she interrupted gently. Would have seen Apache and thought danger. Would have wondered if helping me would bring trouble to their door. You saw a dying child and offered water. That is who you are, even if you've spent years trying to convince yourself otherwise. You don't know who I am. The words came out harsher than he intended. You don't know what I've done. During the territorial wars, I killed men. Apache warriors, white settlers, it didn't matter by the end. I was good at it. Too good. And when it was over, I couldn't." He stopped, his throat closing. "I couldn't wash it off. Couldn't make it right." Erica was quiet for a moment, the firelight dancing across her face. "My people have a saying, the man who cannot forgive himself walks in a shadow of his own making. The sun still shines, but he refuses to feel its warmth. Some men don't deserve warmth. And some men punish themselves because it's easier than accepting grace." She leaned forward slightly. "I do not absolve you, Herb Foster. That is not mine to give. And I do not condemn you, that burden you carry well enough alone. But I ask you one question, and I want you to answer truthfully." Her dark eyes held his without flinching. "Do you want to keep punishing yourself, or do you want to live?" The question hung between them like smoke, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. Herb looked away, toward the hills where the warriors waited, toward the life he'd built on isolation and penance. "I don't know," he whispered. "Then we will wait," Erica said softly, "until you do." Word reached Herb through Sam Garrett, who rode out to the ranch 3 days after Dakota's visit. The old shopkeeper looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the ridges where Apache warriors sat in silhouette against the morning sky. "Creel's organizing men," Sam said without dismounting. "Called it a citizens' militia. Says they're protecting the territory from Apache aggression." He spat the last word like it tasted bad. 15 men signed on already. Maybe more by tomorrow. Herb felt his stomach turn to stone. When? Soon. Maybe a week. He's telling everyone you've brought war to their doorstep, that those warriors up there are scouting for a raid. Sam finally met Herb's eyes. "I know that's not true. But most folks don't care about truth when they're scared. And Creel's good at making people scared." After Sam left, Herb stood on his porch weighing his options. He could leave, disappear into the territories the way he'd done before. But Erica wouldn't leave, and Dakota's warriors would stay as long as she did. Which meant Creel's militia would come regardless, and blood would spill on land that had already seen too much of it. He found Erica by the creek bed, washing clothes in the shallow water. "We have a problem." She looked up, reading his face instantly. The man from town. The one with hatred in his eyes. Dalton Creel. He's gathering men, armed men. They're coming here. Erica stood slowly, water dripping from her hands. "Then I will leave. I will not let my vow bring death to your door. It's too late for that." Herb's voice was flat. "Creel doesn't care if you're here or not. He wants an excuse, and we gave him one. If you leave now, he'll still come. He'll say we're conspiring with your people, that we're planning raids. He'll burn my ranch and hunt your brother's warriors into the hills." He paused. "I need to talk to Dakota." She studied him for a long moment. "You would warn him? Even knowing what it might cost you with your own people?" "They stopped being my people the moment they chose fear over sense." Dakota came at dusk with 3 warriors, their horses materializing from the canyon shadows like spirits taking form. Herb explained the situation, Creel's militia, the timeline, the inevitable confrontation. Dakota listened without interruption, his face unreadable. "You warn me of danger from your own kind," Dakota said finally. "This is an act of honor. This is an act of survival. If your warriors and Creel's militia clash on my land, everyone loses. Then what do you propose?" "We wait. Together. Let them see we're not divided. Let them see that starting a fight here means fighting both of us." Herb looked toward the ridges where more Apache warriors had gathered. "It's not much of a plan, but it's the only one that doesn't end in a massacre." Dakota was silent, considering. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command. "My warriors will remain visible. We will not hide. If these men come seeking war, they will find us ready. But we will not strike first. Neither will I." They stood in the fading light, 2 men from different worlds bound by the same stretch of land and the same woman's unwavering conviction. Above them, the sky darkened to indigo. Around them, warriors both white and Apache began their circling, wolves waiting for the first move, for the first mistake, for the moment when words would no longer be enough. They came with the first light, when the world was still caught between darkness and dawn. Herb heard them before he saw them, the jangle of tack, the creak of leather, the low murmur of men trying to stay quiet and failing. He stepped onto his porch and counted 15 riders spreading out in a line across the valley floor, their rifles visible against the pale sky. Dalton Creel sat at the center on a big gray gelding, his face set hard as iron. On the ridges above, Dakota's warriors rose from their positions like stones coming to life. 30, maybe 40 now, Herb had lost count over the past days. They lined the high ground in perfect formation, spears and rifles held ready, their silhouettes sharp against the lightning sky. They made no sound. They simply appeared, and their silence was more threatening than any war cry. Erica stepped out of her shelter beneath the cottonwood, still dressed in the red ceremonial dress she'd worn since the day she arrived. She walked across the yard and stood beside Herb without hesitation, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. "This is a mistake, Creel," Herb called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Turn around and go home. The only mistake was yours, Foster." Creel's horse shifted beneath him. "You brought this on yourself. Now hand over the Apache woman and maybe we can settle this peaceful. She's under my protection." "Your protection?" Creel laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think you can stand against 15 armed men? Against the whole territory when word spreads what you've done? He does not stand alone." Dakota's voice came from the ridge, strong and clear. He stood at the front of his warriors, his rifle cradled in his arms. "My sister has chosen this man. Any who would harm her must go through me. Through all of us." Creel twisted in his saddle to look up at the warriors, then back at Herb. "So that's how it is. You've chosen sides, Foster. Chosen the savages over your own kind." "I've chosen peace over murder," Herb said. "That's all this is. Peace." Creel's face darkened. "You killed my son and now you lecture me about peace. You harbor their kind on your land and expect us to just accept it." He raised his voice, addressing his men. "This is what happens when a man forgets who he is. When he turns his back on his people for enough." Herb's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail, and immediately every gun in the valley shifted. Creel's militia aimed at him. Dakota's warriors aimed at the militia. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first shot that would turn the valley into a killing ground. "Step aside, Foster," Dakota called down. "Let warriors settle this. My sister's honor does not require your death." "It requires my choice," Herb said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He looked at Erica, at the woman who'd walked back into his life carrying 8 years of devotion and a vow he'd never asked for. Then he looked at Creel, at Dakota, at all the men with fingers on triggers and hatred in their hearts. And he made his choice. Herb lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately, and set it against the porch rail. The movement rippled through both sides, confusion, tension, the collective intake of breath from men expecting violence and finding something else entirely. He stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with finality, and walked to the center of his yard where everyone could see him clearly. Erica's eyes widened, questioning, but she stayed silent. "I've spent 5 years on this land trying to disappear," Herb said, his voice steady and clear in the dawn stillness. "Trying to atone for what I did during the wars by working myself into the ground and keeping everyone at arm's length. I thought that's what I deserved. Thought that's all I'd ever get. He paused, looking at Erica, at the woman who'd crossed impossible distances to stand beside him. But this woman came to my gate and offered me something I stopped believing in a long time ago. She offered me grace. Honor. A future that isn't built on guilt and isolation. Foster, don't, Creel started, but Herb cut him off. I'm going to marry her. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Erica Hodges is under my protection. She'll be my wife, and this will be her home. And any man, white or Apache, who has a problem with that will have to go through me first. It wasn't a threat. There was no anger in his voice, no challenge. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken with the kind of certainty that comes from finally understanding what matters and what doesn't. Creel's face went red. You're a damn fool, Foster. You think marrying her changes anything? You think. I think you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of reasons. Herb gestured to the ridges where Dakota's warriors sat with rifles ready. You came here for a fight, but the only fight you'll get is one you can't win. So you can turn around and ride back to town, or you can start something that'll get every man here killed. Your choice. The militia shifted uneasily, horses stamping, men exchanging glances. They'd come expecting a quick confrontation, maybe some intimidation, possibly a skirmish with a lone rancher. They hadn't counted on facing down 40 Apache warriors on high ground with nothing but open valley between them. Creel stared at Herb for a long moment, his jaw working, his hand tight on his reins. Then he spat into the dirt. This isn't over, Foster. Yes it is. Herb's voice was quiet but absolute. It's been over for a long time. You're just the last one to know it. Creel wheeled his horse around, and his militia followed, retreating across the valley in a ragged line. They didn't ride fast, pride wouldn't allow that, but they rode steady and they didn't look back. When the last rider disappeared over the rise, Herb turned toward the ridge where Dakota stood. The warrior chief studied him in silence, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, deliberately, Dakota raised his rifle above his head, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. You have courage, Foster, he called down, his voice carrying across the quiet valley. That is enough. The warriors behind him lowered their weapons. Some nodded. Others simply watched, but the tension that had stretched tight as wire finally released. Erica moved to Herb's side, her hand finding his. You chose, she said softly. I chose, he agreed, and felt something inside him, something that had been clenched tight for years, finally let go. The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on the first cool morning of autumn when the air carried the promise of change. They held it in the valley beneath the cottonwood where Erica had first made camp, where her fire had burned steady through all the days of waiting. Someone had cleared the ground and laid blankets in a circle, creating a space that belonged to neither world completely but held room for both. Dakota came with 20 of his people, dressed in their finest, beaded leather and turquoise, feathers and silver, the colors of earth and sky woven together. They arrived on horseback at dawn, silent and dignified, and took their places on the eastern side of the circle as the sun climbed behind them. From town came Sam Garrett and his wife, along with 4 other families who'd known Herb long enough to see past Creel's poison. They were fewer than Herb had expected but more than he'd hoped for, and they stood on the western side with awkward respect, unsure of the customs but willing to bear witness. Erica wore the same red ceremonial dress she'd arrived in, but Dakota had brought additional pieces, a shawl decorated with elk teeth, a belt woven with symbols Herb couldn't read but understood meant protection, continuity, blessing. Her hair was braided with sage and wrapped in soft leather. She looked like something between earth and heaven, and when she smiled at him, Herb felt his throat tighten. He'd dressed as best he could, clean shirt, vest, the one pair of boots that weren't worn through. Dakota had offered him an Apache blanket to wear across his shoulders, and after a moment's hesitation, Herb had accepted. It felt right, standing there wrapped in her people's colors, preparing to bind his life to hers. The ceremony itself was conducted in both languages. An Apache elder spoke first, his voice rising and falling in rhythms older than the canyon walls, calling on spirits and ancestors to witness the union. Then Sam's wife, who'd once been a preacher's daughter, read a short passage about love and covenant from a worn Bible she'd brought wrapped in cloth. When it came time for vows, Herb took Erica's hands and spoke the only words that mattered. I spent years believing I didn't deserve a second chance. You proved me wrong. I don't know what I did to earn your devotion, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. Erica's eyes glistened. You already are. They sealed the vows in both traditions, with words spoken over shared bread and water, with a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, with the simple pressing of foreheads together in the Apache way that meant I see you, I choose you, I will walk beside you. As the sun descended toward the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Herb looked around at the gathered witnesses, Apache and white, standing together on his land without weapons, without fear. He looked at Erica beside him, her hand warm in his, her smile soft and certain. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Herb Foster wasn't running from his past or hiding from his future. He was simply here, in this moment, in this place, with this woman who'd seen the worst of what he'd been and chose to love the best of what he could become. He was home. And finally, impossibly, he believed he deserved to be.